Adesso io presenterei, sì, perché comunque il collega Tom Nagel dell'Università, della Facoltà Biotecnica dell'Università di Ljubliana, lo presento io non per togliere il ruolo a professor Bagnotta, ma perché è un collega e ovviamente Tom, scusate che ecco, interrompo la condivisione, Tom è un collega con cui collaboriamo da tanti anni per studiare le foreste vetuste in Europa, facciamo parte di un gruppo di ricerca che si chiama Euforia o Euforia, che studia appunto le foreste attraverso il monitoraggio per aree permanenti in riserve naturali. E quindi si ricollegherà un po' a questo intervento. So please, Tom, sorry, I don't know if you understood a bit of Italian, sorry for this double language, so and so. So Tom Nagel is you can also present yourself a bit. It's a professor at the University of Ljubljana, where he's studying forest demographics and forest natural dynamics and old growth forests. So you will present a talk about why natural forest, old growth forest, and forest reserves are so important in Europe. So
yes, thank you. Thank you, Alfredo. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. I just want to jump right into it. But just say first, it's nice to follow up after Alfredo because he actually covered a lot of what I want to talk about. So I think it's a nice follow-up. But I'm mainly going to be talking about why forest reserves, strict forest reserves, are so important. And I think that fits pretty well into any discussion on mountain forests because, you know, in the European mountains, that's where many of our most well-preserved forests are. Let me just share my screen now. Right, so why do we need more strict forest reserves? I'll talk about this in the context of Slovenia and in Europe. Starting out very broadly, as many of you know, the global population is predicted to increase very rapidly. So we're expected to hit something like 11 billion by the end of the century. And what that means is that we're going to need to produce a lot more timber. So basically, as the human population has increased, the demand for timber has basically kept pace with the human population growth. That's not really surprising. And the same thing is happening in Europe. So over the last 20 years, we've been increasing roundwood production. We've been increasing firewood production. And if you look at the projections, it's predicted that we're going to need to produce a lot more timber in the next 20, 30, 40 years, especially if we want to meet this carbon neutrality goal by 2050 that the European Union has under the Green Deal. Because as you know, woody biomass is considered carbon neutral in the European Union. And also globally, the demand for roundwood is predicted to go up something like 30% by 2050. So we need to produce a lot more wood. But as you know, there's usually a trade-off, right? If we produce a lot more timber in a forest, that often means there's a trade-off with some biodiversity, at least. Maybe not all biodiversity, but some biodiversity. And we have to do this while the climate is changing. So this is a massive challenge, right? How do we produce more timber? How do we maintain native biodiversity and do all that under a changing climate? This is certainly not an easy thing to do for foresters. There's generally two ways to do that. You know, you can either use a land sparing approach or a land sharing approach. So under land sparing, and this is what most of the world does to produce timber and maintain biodiversity. Under the sparing approach, let's say you would protect half of your country's forests in strict reserves where you don't do any management, and the other half of the forest you might be managing very intensively in plantations. On the opposite extreme, if you use a land sharing approach, that means you're producing timber and maintaining native biodiversity in the same time, in the same place, right? Slovenia is a very good example of that. And actually, if you look at the European Union in general, or Europe in general, is a pretty good example of a land sharing approach. So we recently collected data on the amount of forest area in every European country, or almost every European country, that's strictly protected, where there's no management. And that's these dark green parts of these pie charts here. And what you should immediately see is that we don't really protect much of the forested landscape across Europe. And most countries, so like Slovenia and other countries in the Balkans that rely on kind of close to nature management, they often protect less than 1% of their forests. Italy, if you see here, is actually doing quite well regarding strict forest protection. You're among the highest in Europe. But in general, Europe does not protect that many forests strictly, right? And that's because it uses this sharing approach to maintain biodiversity. The problem with that, and I'm not saying a sharing approach can work quite well, but one problem with that approach is that over the entire landscape of the whole entire continent, basically, that means we don't have forest structures like this. And Alfredo also showed some pictures of this. So these are old growth forests where very large trees develop, they die naturally, they form deadwood. Often very large amounts of deadwood accumulate in these old growth forests. Not just deadwood, but there is also habitat trees that as they get old, they develop many different unique microhabitats, which are also associated with biodiversity. Here's a good example. And so, as most of you, I hope know, who are listening, there's a very important link, of course, between these old growth habitats, especially deadwood, and a lot of our forest biodiversity. And so the taxonomists estimate that something like 25%, so many thousands of species in our European forest, are very connected with deadwood. So they require deadwood at some point in their life cycle. So these are, of course, many species of herbs, bryophytes, lichens, fungi, insects, especially beetles, and a few mammals. And so you can imagine if we remove the deadwood and the other old growth habitats across a very large part of the landscape, then these species, of course, would suffer. So many species of saprophytic fungi, many species of beetles. And in fact, if you just look at the IUCN data, for example, on saprophytic beetles, you see that a fairly large percentage of these species are threatened in Europe. That's not surprising. And quite a few of them have declining populations. And I think the scariest thing is for about half of all these species, we don't really know what their populations are doing because they're hard to study. They're hard to monitor the population densities of many of these species. Let me just give you a little bit of example of what's happening in Slovenia. So Slovenia, as you know, is a very forested country. It has a long tradition of very I would say kind of ecologically based, small scale, continuous cover forest management. So I think Dušan Rosenberger is going to talk about that with you. So the forestry is very world renowned, I would say. And there is about 164 forest reserves in Slovenia, give or take one or two right now. But if you look at the size distribution of the forest reserves, you can see that most of them are quite small, so less than 10 or 20 hectares. And then if you look at what's happening with the deadwood in Slovenia, we can compare, for example, how much deadwood is in our old growth forests, how much is in forest reserves that were managed in the past, and then how much deadwood is in managed forests. So just to quickly go over this, the total deadwood volume in our old growth forest is about 165 cubic meters per hectare on average. And in the managed forest, it's about 20 cubic meters per hectare. So that's almost like an 80 or 90% loss of habitat for these saprophytic species. Also, you can look at deadwood quality. So for example, in the old growth forest, most of the deadwood volume, not surprisingly, is made up of large logs, larger than 50 centimeters in diameter, whereas in managed forests, it's mostly small pieces. And finally, if you just look at the distribution of large trees, so kind of a proxy for habitat trees, which might have a lot of canopy deadwood or microhabitats, they're much higher in old growth forests. So we expect something like 50 trees over 50 centimeters in diameter in our beech forest and only 6 in the managed forest. So there's a big difference between the managed and the old growth forest. And if you look at, we don't have that much good data on biodiversity in Slovenia. The best data we have is from our BirdLife International organization. And I'm showing you here the distribution of the white-backed woodpecker, which is a very rare woodpecker in Slovenia and Southern Europe, but it's very connected with deadwood. And you can see it has a very small population in Slovenia, so less than 150 breeding pairs, and it's mostly occurs in forest reserves. And so if this species is doing poorly, we suspect that other deadwood-dependent species might be doing poorly across the country, even though we're using close-to-nature silviculture. Another thing I want to talk about briefly is disturbance. So, we hear a lot about disturbance, and often we hear disturbance is bad, but of course it's an integral part of our forest ecosystems. And this is another reason why forest reserves are very important. This is a wind throw, for example, that happened in Slovenia this year in Triglav National Park. This is very typical for us, these kind of intermediate severity wind throw events. And just very briefly, if you look at the community composition of, this is for beetles, for example, but this can be done for many species. There's a very different composition of deadwood-dependent species that occur in the shade versus in the sun. And you can see here, right, totally different species occur in deadwood in the sun. And often the deadwood in the sunny positions has a higher abundance and species richness. That should not be really surprising because these species over evolutionary time evolved under disturbance, and disturbance is the only event that produces a lot of deadwood that's exposed to the sun, right? But what we do in our managed forests, we often salvage log these areas. So this is the same wind throw event a few weeks later. And so we're not leaving that much deadwood in sun-exposed positions for biodiversity. What's even more problematic is that if you look at the size distribution of strict forest reserves across the entire continent of Europe, which is shown right here, we can see like of the about 30,000 strict forest reserves, about 70% of them are less than 50 hectares in size, 50% are less than 20 hectares in size. And there's only, I could count on both hands how many are larger than about 10,000 hectares, okay? Or actually there's about 40 of them above 10,000 hectares. I'm mentioning this because we need much larger forest reserves to capture these disturbances, which are important for the biodiversity that's dependent on them. So for example, this is just showing a map of a wind throw that happened in Slovenia. And you can see that if we put a 50-hectare forest reserve on this landscape, we wouldn't capture any of these disturbance patches, right? We need to move up to about 5,000 hectares to really start to capture natural disturbance regimes. But that's a very rare size reserve across the continent. All right, I want to shift gears really quickly now to end the presentation. I want to talk about carbon. Alfredo already showed you this global carbon budget picture. But if you just look at this green part here, right, which is the terrestrial sink, what scientists seem to be very worried about recently is that it seems to be leveling off a little bit, right? And that leveling off might be caused by tree mortality, a decline in photosynthesis, maybe increasing disturbance. And in fact, if you look at long-term mortality rates, annual mortality rates of canopy trees across European forests, this is a study that was based on remote sensing. You see that it has been going up, right? That could be because of background mortality increasing, disturbance, or just increasing forest management. But what I want to really point out to you is that we don't find evidence of increasing mortality rates yet in our strict forest reserves. So very briefly, in Slovenia, we have a small network of old growth forests where we've been tracking tree mortality and demography in general for the last 40 years with individually tagged trees. And here I'm showing you annual mortality over the last 40 years for beech trees. And you can see that there's variation, right? So these peaks here are related to individual disturbance events, but there's no long-term change in the rate of background mortality. It's hovering around 1%. And then if we look at how much carbon is being stored in these ecosystems, so Alfredo already covered this quite well. These are our old growth forests in Slovenia, showing the green is living above ground biomass and the brown is dead biomass. You can see that the total carbon per hectare in tons is quite high. So between 200 and 300 tons per hectare. And if we compare that to managed forests in Slovenia, which actually have a quite high density of carbon compared to some other forests. So the managed forests have around 80 or 90 tons per hectare. So we're looking at 2 to 3 times higher amount of carbon in our old growth forests. And you can look at this all over Europe. So this is data collected from old growth forests and strict forest reserves across the entire continent. And you can see that there's a lot of variability here, but especially in this temperate region, old growth forests are regularly storing between 200 and 300 tons of carbon per hectare. So that's a huge amount of carbon. And this is another graph that Alfredo already talked about this a bit, but if you look at where the carbon is, so this is the diameter distribution of all that data from the last figure. So this typical reverse J shape, but it turns out that about 75% of all the carbon in these systems is maintained or is stored, in trees that are above 50 centimeters in diameter, okay? Also for Slovene forests, about 70% or 80% of the carbon in our old growth forest is maintained in trees above 50 centimeters in diameter. But if you remember, I showed you a few slides ago that we don't have so many of those really large trees in our managed forests. The reason is because as trees get larger and larger and larger, even though they're growing a tiny bit, usually less than a millimeter per year, they actively fix larger amounts of carbon than the year before, okay? So every year, they basically have the mass growth rate increases every year. And that's why these really large trees are very important for storing carbon. All right, and here's where I'm ending. You remember I told you in the beginning that we can either protect forests or we can, balance biodiversity and timber production with either a sharing or sparing approach. There's a lot of research going into this now on what the best way to actually optimize native biodiversity and still produce more timber every year as we need to. And it turns out that when you do modeling studies on this, the best solution often seems to be some kind of triad approach, where if we increase the amount of forest reserves on the landscape, as the new biodiversity strategy in the EU is suggesting, then we might need to balance this with either increasing timber production in our kind of extensive zone, or even increasing or keeping the amount of plantations that we currently have on the landscape. And so here's the take-home message. Currently, Europe does not protect enough unmanaged forests, I think, to maintain populations of these demanding old growth dependent species. Threats of increasing climate-related tree mortality or disturbance in unmanaged forests seem to be unfounded. You often hear that, oh, we should not protect more forests because they're just going to be damaged by disturbance. And I think that's a very poor argument to take. In fact, if we don't protect more areas, we're never going to give the species that depend on old growth conditions a chance to adapt to climate change. So in fact, disturbance is, I would say, desirable in forest reserves if we have large forest reserves that capture natural disturbance regimes. There is, of course, a huge co-benefit to protecting more forest reserves in Europe because they store a very large amount of carbon. And finally, some kind of zoning approach, like a land-sparing triad approach, might offer a viable solution to produce more timber in the future, but still maintain this rare biodiversity dependent on old growth forests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your home message, especially part of the presentation. And it was nice to see that Italy once is not in the last position. It was good, probably thanks to the Carabinieri Forestali that make a lot of force in conserving, and also the fact that we have a lot of mountain area. So it's sometimes our geological aspect that make our rule better than other, probably.